right, so I think we ended part one where I was flying back from Scotland to New London, Connecticut to rejoin the crew of the USS Lafayette. We were slated to go into the shipyard that fall, but we spent the summer doing midshipman ops where I think it's their junior year, the Academy midshipmen get an opportunity to go to sea on a real ship of some sort, and those that had shown an interest, I guess, in submarines would come and ride our submarine at that time. And we'd just go out for the day, out into Long Island, out past Long Island to the 100-fathom curve and dive, do what we called angles and dangles, surfacing and submerging and that sort of thing, running through a few drills and emergency type of training exercises to give them a feel for what goes on a submarine. And then we'd be back in before dark. And we spent basically the summer doing that, and then entered the shipyard for conversion from Polaris missiles to Poseidon missiles. And this was actually the first time that conversion happened. So we were kind of the guinea pigs. It took an extra year, I think, if I remember right. So we spent about 2 years in the electric boat shipyard undergoing that conversion. They had to cut off the top of the missile tubes and put extensions on the missile tubes, and that the welding of that on the high yield steel hull was not the best technique or something at the time. Had a lot of cracking. They do X-rays, find the cracks, and then they'd have to grind it all out again and re-weld it. So that's what took so long. But eventually we did emerge from the shipyard. You go on a 6-month shakedown cruise. You know, initially, of course, you have the sea trials coming out of the shipyard. You get through with that, and that, I don't know, probably took 3 months or something. I'm not sure now how long that was, but then you go on the shakedown cruise, which is going down to Cape Canaveral to fire a test missile. And that was pretty interesting. As an assistant weapons officer, I got to pull the trigger for the test missile type of evolutions. And we also went over to Exuma Sound in the Bahamas, where there's a range for calibrating sonar, and down to Puerto Rico, where there's a range for firing exercise torpedoes, or at least there were in those days. And that sort of thing. And so at the end of the 6 months, we were all certified, could go back up to Charleston, South Carolina, which getting to the Naval Weapons Station was a lot of fun. It's I don't know, 10, 12 miles or something up the river, winding river with changing sandbars and currents and so on. And I got to be the officer of the deck doing that, so it was a very exciting trip up the river. And as weapons officer, I was busy the whole time, so loading missiles, and then headed back down the river. And once again, I got to be the officer of the deck and out to sea and out to our patrol area. So we're back into the cycle of 2 crews, 3 months out, 3 months away, and 3 months back up in New London, Connecticut. So
what is your home port at this time? Is it still
the ship's home port at this time changed from Rhoda, Spain before the conversion to Holy Loch, Scotland after the conversion, but the families and the off crew were all out of New London, Connecticut instead of Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay.
where I started. And during this whole time, I initially went on the Lafayette on the Blue Crew, and then when I had to do back patrols, I was transferred to the Gold Crew, and then during the shipyard, I was back in the Blue Crew, and out of the shipyard now I'm in the Gold Crew again. So I was in both crews twice during the 5 years that I was on board. So the big advantage, I guess, of the Poseidon missile over the Polaris was range, as well as multiple warheads. But for me, or for the ship, I guess it was the range. So now we could be a lot farther from our targets and still be within range. So it made hiding from everybody much easier.
So your family, during all this traveling that you're doing from Europe to South Carolina, Puerto Rico, wherever it is, they're just staying.
They were still up in New London because I had moved them up to New London when we went in the shipyard, and I forget, that was like about 72, I think it was, and in fact that's the first time that I was really back at a real naval base. Is when we first got back to New London, or got to New London for the shipyard, and in those days that was the beginning of the all volunteer force. And one of the things that I remember about being there is one that we got to move into Navy housing, which was an excellent experience for me with 3 kids at that time, and close to the base, close to the electric boat and all that, and I got to note the changing during that period of the all volunteer force. We got a little more pay raise, and the Navy started. I guess you'd say, treating you a little better when you have a family, whereas my experience in Hawaii had been, if the Navy wanted you to have a wife, they'd have issued you one in the sea bag. And now the commissary bags had the hardest job in the Navy is a Navy wife. That was the big logo printed on the grocery bags at the commissary. So, it reminds me that I should say something about probably my greatest luck I've probably ever had was meeting my future wife and marrying my wife, Chris Landalo Day. And, because if it's not, if there's nobody at home taking care of everything that breaks while you're gone, and taking care of all the issues, it can make a very stressful and very short, probably, career in the Navy. I do recall when I first got on the diesel boats, they read someplace out in Hawaii, I think the figure was 4, but 55% of the submariners that had been married were divorced. And I had consciously tried to ensure that didn't happen to me. And it's really more a testament to my wife that she persevered through all the trials and tribulations that being a Navy wife can have than it was to me. I certainly didn't make it easy for her in 24 years, even though she knew at the time I entered the Navy, we were going together, and she knew when she married me that I was thinking about a career, but hadn't made any decision at that point. So anyway, we're in the on Lafayette still, and about 5 years or a little more, I guess, into being on there and I thought I was going to be even longer on board. I had been promoted through Lieutenant JG and was now a lieutenant, and still on the same sub, still weapons in the weapons department. And actually enjoying it, because after 5 years on the same ship, the ship, how it handles and so on. But it's still a very busy life. And I get a call out of the blue from the detailer saying that he's working on my next assignment. which kind of blew me away. I thought I was still going to be at least another year on board, since I had done both assistant weapons officer and done what they call fleeting up to weapons officer. Usually you would have a short tour in between those two assignments. But anyway, gave me a couple of choices, and one of the choices was the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff. It's a staff of the Joint Chiefs that was out at SAC headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. And so anyway, I decided I'd rather do that than go to the other choice, which was in Washington, D.C. And I went out there. It was another interesting experience, I guess you'd say, of just arriving. We arrived in November. As it turns out, as usual in November out there in Nebraska, it's windy. And the cornfields, the corn husks had all dried, and as they tumbled due to the wind across the land and trees and so on, it gets broken up into little bitty pieces that kind of look like a snowstorm and hit you in the face. And it wasn't particularly pleasant, but that was the introduction to Nebraska. And where we worked was known as the Mole Hole. It was 4 or 5 stories underground, and our job was to do the planning of the nuclear war, the weapons to target assignments, and timing and so on associated with that. And I got to work on a few different teams, like the bomber team and the Air Force's Minuteman teams, before joining the submarine-launched missile team. And during that time, I also got to go to the Air Force Staff Missile Weapons Officer course out at Edwards Air Force Base, and got to ride a B-52 bomber, doing what they called the elephant walk. The bombers, the bombers had alert forces that would have to launch into the air within 15 minutes. So in Grand Forks, North Dakota, it's pretty cold. And to be able to do that, they would just circle on a racetrack kind of airstrip to keep the engines warm and the crew on board and everything. So I would assume if they had to start up from scratch from a cold, that it would take a lot longer than 15 minutes, I would assume, but I don't know. So anyway, I got to do some interesting things, go through some Minuteman silos just for orientation and that sort of thing. I was assigned to the battle staff of the Looking Glass and the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, so I got to ride on both of those airplanes and participate in some exercises associated with the at the national level of the training for launching a nuclear war. So that was all kind of interesting. And it was supposed to be a 2-year tour. I kept requesting and getting extensions, so I ended up spending 4 years there. And that was nice. So that was a long time from the Navy, though, because my next assignment was a navigator of a Trident submarine undergoing construction. There wasn't any Trident submarines, also really known as the Ohio class submarine. The Ohio was the first of the class, and that was in the shipyard being built. Hadn't even started sea trials yet. And I was slated to go as the navigator of the Georgia, which was the 4th Trident submarine. So when I got there, of course, it turns out I was the first one of the crew to arrive, and things were not progressing on schedule. So I was assigned to the FBM off crew squadron, and I kind of hung around the office spaces for a week or so, and then I happened to overhear a couple of officers in the administrative office talking, saying something about they were looking at sending, and I had made lieutenant commander by this time, just as I left JSTPS. Lieutenant Commander O'Day as a submarine liaison officer on an aircraft carrier. And I'm thinking, I don't want to go to an aircraft carrier. So I went down to the shipyard. Well, I first went through the off-crew offices looking to see if I knew anybody that I could find out if there's any navigators getting ready to retire or get transferred where I could find a billet. So I was out finding my own billet, and I got down to Electric Boat to the Michigan, and it turns out that one of my sub-school classmates was the navigator and was retiring. And so I went in and talked to the CO of the Michigan and got myself transferred to the Michigan as a replacement. So that's how I really ended up on the USS Michigan.
Is the navigator position, billet, is that typically a lieutenant commander, like department head?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's usually the third senior officer on board, with the XO and the CO being the senior one, and it's usually the senior watch officer, meaning that you make up the watch bills and so on for the officers. So of course we're under construction. The Ohio's ahead of us. So again, I spent about 2 years at Electric Boat on new construction. And so now I've got about 21 years in. And I'm thinking that I probably want to retire. And in fact, I came probably within about 10 days of retiring. But a few months prior to that, I had a visit from a shore command up in Newport, Rhode Island, that was the Trident Command and Control System maintenance activity. And they came down to recruit me to not retire and to come up and fill a billet that they had available up there. And they had no officers or enlisted folks with actual Trident submarine experience, although I can't say that I had a lot of experience, but I certainly knew the systems, particularly for the command and control system, because all that now fell under the navigator on a Trident submarine. And in fact, the weapons officer worked for the navigator as part of the Nav Ops department. The weapons fell under that. So I had spent some time up there at, the acronym for that was TRISMA up in Newport, because we did our training for the command and control system up in Newport. The trainers at New London, Connecticut weren't of the appropriate type to do our training. The training centers were going to be down in Kings Bay, Georgia, and then Bangor, Washington, and they hadn't been built yet. So we would just bus up to Newport for the day and use the actual command and control systems that were going to come down and go onto our boat. And so I was a little familiar with it, and I decided that, yeah, I'd stay in instead of retiring and go up there. And I'm glad I did. It was an interesting, very interesting assignment. It was a land-based a government-owned, contractor-operated facility where they would bring in the command and control system that would come, pieces that would come from like, I don't know, 110 or 20 or something different vendors around the country, get wired up with the actual wires that would interconnect the pieces of equipment and test it out to ensure that it worked. And the idea was like at, let's say, General Motors assembly line for a car. If you said to General Motors, oh yeah, I don't want you to put the regular factory radio in, I'm going to provide you a radio and put it in. And I want you to put it in. And I want you to make sure it works. Well, if you held up their production line, you can imagine what you would have to pay in extra fees, I guess you'd say, for having held up their production line. And it was the same way with electric boat building these things. They wanted to make sure that these systems actually worked, and you didn't spend more time at their shipyard because you had to have backfitting done to some systems. So that's what that facility was all about. It had 100 government service people approximately and 10 active duty Navy people. I went in as test and fleet support assistant department head. The head of the department was a government service individual. And while I had probably at that time, I guess I probably spent almost 5 years of my careers in shipyards. And the duties of a crew during the shipyard can be a couple of things, but for sure one of them is to monitor the testing and occasionally participate in the testing, but not very often. Mostly it's monitoring it, so you have to be familiar with the test plans and kind of watch what's going on to make sure that it was being properly done or properly reported results type of thing. And so I had a little idea what was going on, but I certainly learned a lot that first year when I was the assistant department head. The department head was a really good engineer and administrator that taught me a lot about the whole process of developing test plans and executing the testing. And I did quite a bit of traveling. I actually rode on some of the shakedown cruises for the Michigan, and the Ohio as well. And I at the end of the first year, I actually got promoted, I guess you'd say, to executive officer of the command. It was a separate command that reported to OpNav via NAVC. So actually OpNav was our bosses, but NAVC was the Naval Sea Systems Command, was the organization that we really coordinated with the most, because they're the ones that had the responsibility for the development and the production of the Trident submarine. So I spent a year as XO, and then our CO got transferred, and I was promoted to the commanding officer of the facility. So I spent a year doing that, and once again the detailer called me up to talk to me about my next assignment, and frankly, I didn't care for any of those assignments. So I elected to retire instead. And a lot of my decision making on that was family orientated. I still had 3 kids at home, 2 of which were in high school. I kind of promised my wife when we moved to London that would be the last move for us. I think we'd had 27 moves in our Navy career up to that point. all of the assignments that he was talking about were going to have me 1 year in one port and another year in another port type of thing. And one of those options was Holy Loch, Scotland, and they didn't have a high school, Department of Defense high school, so my kids would have to go to London to a Department of Defense high school and live in a boarding house, and that just wasn't going to happen. So I just chose to retire instead. So I don't know if you want to hear about my next 15 years as a defense contractor, but they actually were a little bit more interesting to me in a lot of ways than my Navy career up to that point, which actually had been kind of interesting as it was, But I kind of followed in the same mode that I had been working this last 3 years. I joined a small company that was doing test and evaluation, providing the bodies to do the test and evaluation of the Trident submarines, as well as a few other jobs. We had some jobs associated with the torpedo programs, the Mark 48 torpedo program down in New London for the development squadron there, and things like that. And I got the opportunity to buy an interest in the company. So there ended up to be 3 equal partners in it, and we grew it from 11 to 33 people. And it wasn't. It was more stressful that 2 years that we did that than anything in my Navy career, to tell you the truth. And the opportunity came to sell it to another company, the business. We had won a big contract, and so we took that opportunity to sell it. We'd also seen the Berlin Wall come down, the demand for a peace dividend, and knew that as a really small defense contractor, we might not have a long lifespan either. So we got out of that, and I stayed working with the company that bought us for a few years, still in the Trident program. But about 1990, I got out of that and went with another company, and my whole rationale for that was in the hopes of getting into research and development versus construction of and testing and operation of submarines. And that was interesting. We spent 4 years working on a torpedo project, and another year doing a civilian-orientated program that really evolved from one of my good friends working there was a fly fisherman, and he wanted to figure out how to make his fly pole cast farther. And I was the lab manager for an acoustic lab, although I was the only employee of the acoustic lab. I was the only employee assigned to it, so I managed myself mostly. And we started off at lunchtime putting sensors on the fly rod and doing some casting with it, trying to figure out the modes of vibration. And to make a long story short, we eventually did figure out how to do that all on our own time, Saturdays and lunch hours and after work. But we got just so far when we decided we'd get Orvis fishing rod and so on involved. And we actually got them to send us about 20-some poles that are $500 a piece to cut up and use as we wanted to. We eventually figured out how to dampen them, and by that time the company had gotten involved, obviously, and the company got the patent and sold the patent to Orvis. So we were on a roll, and this, you got to realize, is now the mid-90s, and almost every defense contractor was looking for ways to get to do civilian work versus military work. And so we got into the golf club testing and tweaking, I guess you could say. We got a couple of contracts to do that and so on. But in the end, particularly when we got into the golf club, every vice president of the company wanted to be in on the sales pitches to the golf companies out in California. And so we never made any more money at it. We lost money on the whole deal. And we went on, luckily, to more work. The Virginia-class submarine started development, and we got to do the acoustic research and development for quieting on the Virginia-class submarine, which was a completely different technique from what had been used in the Trident submarine. And I spent a couple years doing that, and then I thought that I would retire. Actually, I got laid off from that company when the Virginia class work was done, and I spent about a year looking for a job, but I didn't find anything that really interested me. I thought I'd just retire till my son, youngest son, decided he wanted to go to college, and he didn't want to go to in-state and live at home. He wanted to go out of state, and so I kind of made a deal with him that he'd go to the state, get a job, become a resident, and I would go get a job and help him. So we both did that, and went down to Washington, D.C., and I got a job as Program Management Support for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. And when I had been with my previous employer, we had done a couple of DARPA jobs for them, just small jobs that actually were kind of interesting, but they had to do with sniper programs. So in the end, though, I got to work as Program Management Support, a contractor supporting DARPA in the sensor programs. And that was really interesting work, because DARPA's role in the defense R&D world is basically to fund big corporations and universities and so on with money to do basic research. So they wouldn't necessarily develop a whole system, although they did. They developed as I remember, the stealth bomber completely. And the other one that I had that just comes to mind is the armor for the Humvees in Africa. At that particular time, we're talking about 2000, I think. We were active there, and DARPA actually developed the armor and sent like 100 sets for 100 MVs over there, because the Army wouldn't to put on for those guys. So, but anyway, yeah, I worked for the sensors program, and we did some just really interesting sensor type of programs. Sarajevo was a hot spot in those days, and we got to send some stuff over there to be tested out. And the basic focus was on urban warfare, how a soldier could look around the corner, see what's going on, or see what's going on inside a building or a room, how they could communicate when you have all these big buildings kind of blocking traditional radio waves and stuff like that. So that's what was really interesting about it. And now in the last, I'm going to say 3, 4, 5 years, I've seen a few civilian types of products, I guess you could say, that I'm quite sure leveraged off of that basic research that we did. Part of DARPA's program at the time was they had to find a civilian use for the research as well as the military use. So they not only had to sell it to the services to carry on to develop as a complete system, but they had to find some civilian companies that would want to take that research and build some type of civilian use out of it. Dual use, I think it was referred to. And so my job there mostly was involved with writing up the solicitations to go in the Commerce Business Daily that would solicit proposals from universities and companies to do that. And then once the government manager, made his decision on which ones he's going to go with, then I would get involved with monitoring the contract, particularly the deliverables, which would be reports and testing plans and testing analysis would all come back, and I would review it and make comments to give to the government guy who made all the decisions on it. Us support, we're just doing a lot of the legwork, I guess you could say, but still it gave a view of where all that was going. And so I really liked that. I talked my wife into going to D.C. We lived across in an apartment building across the street from the office buildings that I worked in, which was next to the office buildings that DARPA was in. So it was kind of nice, right over a metro stop. We could spend weekends going to the Smithsonian buildings and stuff like that, and the monuments. And I talked her into it as a vacation, a long vacation. I'll keep the job as long as we're having fun. And of course, the kids were all grown and gone by that time. But unfortunately, I heard about another job that I thought was going to be even more fun. And so I gave my resume to the company that was bidding on this type of work. And lo and behold, they won the contract. And I ended up as the program manager on the contract for that. And work was down in Key West, Florida. And it was for the Naval Air Warfare Center out of Pax River, but they had a detachment down there that operated the only range on the East Coast where the Navy could actually explode any sort of weapons underwater. And so that was the job. Plus, we operated, or we're contracted to operate 7 Navy vessels with contractor crews. So the same company was operating a helicopter carrier up around Panama City area. And that helicopter carrier was manned by contractors. And its job was to train the Air Force helicopter pilots to land on a Navy carrier. So other than that, it was just a training role. And they operated some EPA ships up in Environmental Protection Agency ships up in the Great Lakes and some Navy small craft down in Puerto Rico.
This is more recent, right?
This is now 2001 time frame, yeah. Yeah, 2000 to 2001 winter. I went down in, I think it was December, started work. But what lured me down there was none of that, because I really never had a big interest in surface ships. But they had one old diesel submarine, hull number 567, and I had served on the 566. That was my last diesel sub. And this was the USS Trout, and it was in, like, I'm going to say 1980, was up at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard when undergoing overhaul and turnover to the Iranian Navy when they took over the embassy. So obviously it didn't get turned over to the Iranian Navy, but it was basically completed. I think that was on sea trials, actually, when that happened. So it was in excellent condition, and it just went back into the mothball fleet at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard area until, let me think the years now we're talking about 98 or 99. The Naval Air Warfare people managed to get it out of mothballs and towed down to Key West. And so it was down there, and the contract that the company I went to work for won was to operate it with a crew, a contractor crew, and also to first do the engineering and the conversion of the diesel submarine so that it could be remotely operated. And the idea was that we would put about 11 crew members on board, take it out to a dive point, everybody get off onto one of the other 7 vessels that we operated, and we would remotely operate it so that it would dive and maneuver as an airdrop torpedo target. The Naval Air Station Key West is the Navy's anti-submarine warfare specialist from the air, and they needed a target because the United States Navy had mid-70s, no, mid-80s, they had gotten rid of the last diesel submarine, somewhere around 84, I think. And the Canadians at that particular time, I think, were down to either 1 or 2 diesel submarines, so they didn't really have the resource to send play in our training exercises. We'd given a lot of submarines to the old diesel submarines on Lend-Lease to countries in South America, and occasionally we had opportunities to participate with them in training exercises. But even by that time, by 2000, you're talking about a 40-year-old diesel submarine. Many of those had already sunk, and since they didn't have big submarine navies, numbers of submarines and submariners, they weren't necessarily trained to the same levels that we were. So anyway, the idea was to be able to operate this. So that's what really drew me to that job. Somebody was going to pay me to have my own little remotely operated submarine to play around with. And even though I kind of knew that the probability of all this really happening was low, there was a lot of opposition to this within the Naval Sea Systems Command. They didn't really want a diesel submarine operating by anybody, including contractors associated with the United States Navy, because then it makes it harder to get money from Congress. You know, the new Trident submarines were costing between $1 and $2 billion a piece then. And if they ever figured out that they could build diesel submarines for a few $100 million, you know, maybe they would want to do that. And I kind of agree with the concept, to tell you the truth. In fact, the Virginia class was built as a more of a littoral warfare submarine versus the blue water submarines of the past. And but anyway, after 3 months, I realized that it was never going to happen with that submarine, and I didn't really have a lot of interest in operating the surface research vessels that they had down there and were operating. So I quit that job, and part of the reason for quitting right at that time is I needed some surgery. There wasn't any place in Key West, obviously, where I could get the surgery. In fact, the very few doctors were even in the health plans that the company had. I'd have to travel to Miami just to see a real doctor. And so I elected to go up to Walter Reed and have that done. And I just elected to quit the job at the time and not worry about it, which it turns out was good because things didn't go well with the surgery, and I would have been out of work for about 6 months if I had tried to continue to work, and by that time I just decided that I didn't need to work anymore. So I started my real retirement at that point. I guess that's the end of my Navy story.
So before we go into like reflections and looking back, it seems like the Navy gave you the opportunity to learn so much more than just naval warfare. Like going to Nebraska, are you planning like war games involving all branches with other members of the military, or are you strictly focusing on the submarine fleet?
No, we planned it all. And what we were planning weren't games. They were the actual nuclear war plan that would have gotten executed. Not only did we do our own forces, the planes, the land-based ICBMs and the submarine-launched ICBMs, but I personally planned for a couple of years the UK missile submarines. The French also had some, but they didn't participate, with their planning. We never did any of their type of planning, but I did the UK's. Their missile systems and their whole missile compartment was our missile compartment. They basically purchased it. I don't know how all that's done, but they basically purchased it through the U.S. Navy's auspices. And in fact, the U.S. Navy would even have some personnel over there kind of monitoring what's going on and that sort of thing. I got an opportunity to tour the Vickers shipyard where it's all done. I had a close friend that was a UK weapons government service type of guy. And after I had retired and he had retired, I made a trip over there and got to look at their program a little bit from an unclassified point of view.
Yeah.
So,
what about your perspective of the military in general? Looking back on your career, you start right before Vietnam and during that whole Vietnam involvement, and then you transition more into the Cold War aspect of things. Yeah. So I'm just curious how your perspective of the military changes from a not so great war to now we're constantly on the, because you talked about it in the previous interview session about like, your patrols when you were off doing the rota patrols, it was a lot of nothingness, but then fear that something could happen anytime.
Right.
And just that like dynamic of this really bad war of Vietnam. Now we're in the Cold War, constantly on the brink of nuclear catastrophe.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much it really changed. I mean, I never had much fear, I guess you'd say, or concern about being on the old diesel submarines, except during the period that we operated in the Vietnam waters, and particularly in the within that 12-mile limit, the blue water versus inshore waters. And when we're inshore waters doing our ops, we could hear in the distance, some distance. They were never real close. The North Vietnamese torpedo patrol boats were coming out, and I assume that was like depth charges that they were. So there was a few times when it seemed a little closer than what I would have liked, I guess. But nothing that was really earth-shattering. Whereas when I got onto the nukes and so on, we had a couple of incidents, I guess you could say, where you really wondered what was going on. One of the things that you practice doing when you come particularly out of a shipyard, and that was at least that was the case. I guess you do it quite a bit, but it was the case that I particularly recall, where you do a reactor scram, meaning that you shut down the nuclear reactor, and then go through the process of starting it up again from scratch. And during that time, you try to keep the submarine at periscope depth. And maybe just enough weight on the battery because your batteries aren't very big on those nuclear submarines. They're mostly just for heating up the water in the reactor, and you try to stay at periscope depth. So, bottom line is that we were kind of rusty, I guess you'd say. Haven't been in a shipyard for 2 years. And it's at night, so the control room is rigged for red, meaning you had red covers on all the lights, so that when they come up to periscope depth, the officer of the deck could, the conning officer of the deck could look through the periscope without being blinded by the night vision not being there. Sometimes we also wore patches as well as the red lights in the control room, to tell you the truth, most of the time. You're trying to stay there at periscope depth by flooding a little water in, trying to maintain a neutral buoyancy, blow a little water out, that sort of thing. And the chief of the watch would operate the ballast control panel, and turns out that because it was rigged for red and we were very rusty, and I guess he forgot which way there was a lever. You put it up for blowing air out, and you put the lever down for flooding it. Well, he just kept flooding it, it turns out. And so we started to sink. And I forget the numbers, but let's say anything over 200 feet. I couldn't tell you how deep we could go. Nowadays, those classes of submarines could all be unclassified, but our depths were classified in those days. So anyway, we kept going down, and I kept telling them, well, blow another 1,000 pounds to sea. Blow another 1,000 pounds to sea. Until we had all the water out of the ballast control tank, and I thought, but instead he was flooding. So we had it full, which means we were sinking. And as we approached the test depth point, I just made the decision. Of course, as we passed about 600 feet. I on one MC make the announcement, Captain to the con, because I don't know what's going on. Why are we sinking? I get reports from all the compartments. There's no flooding. All the tank levels, except for the ballast control tank, evidently, were reported as being normal. And as we approach test depth, I just decided to do a main ballast tank blow, so I do a main ballast tank blow, which puts so much air in you kind of pop up to the surface, but I decided that no, I don't want to do that. This is like blowing the whole exercise, because if we did this on patrol and be on the surface, we would have been found. Of course, just doing a main ballast tank blow is so noisy that you could have been found. So anyway, we get back up, approaching periscope depth. I reflood the tanks, which is really a no-no, not in accordance with normal operating procedures. If you do a blow, you're supposed to go all the way to the surface. But we catch it. I'm thinking, boy, kind of saved that, but I'm going to get chewed out for not following procedures, but it worked. I should be good. No, we're still flooded. We sink again. So this time as we approach test depth again, I really get worried, and I do a main ballast tank blow. Captain still never ever came to the bridge. And all I can figure is he must have had a lot more confidence in me than I had in me. So this time I do an emergency blow, which means instead of 3,000-pound air, you're throwing 4,500-pound air into those main ballast tanks, and you really go fast. There is no catching it on the way up this time. We go up and surface. And turn on all the lights in the control room and start trying to figure out what the heck's been going on before we would dive again. So at the same time, we had a change of watch. Although I stayed on as officer of the deck, I just wasn't going to give it up until I knew what was going on, and nobody wanted to relieve me until they knew what was going on. And luckily, the new chief of the watch discovered the problem right away. So, but that was probably more than a few moments. That was probably 15 to 30 minutes at least, I'd say, of sheer terror when you're going down and you can't get up. That's the nightmare. We had a few other instances where the navigator was plotting a location, and we were our locations, and he was determining that we were actually moving backwards, that we should be moving forward, and we were actually moving backwards. And in the end, what we figured out was that we were actually being towed backwards by a big trawler whose nets had encompassed our sail. And so we got towed backwards. And that was not as bad as the other incident, but it was still of concern. It took a while to figure out what the heck was going on. But there was a lot of other instances where we used to have to, because of the range of the Polaris, we used to have to operate in the Mediterranean Sea, and there's just a lot of traffic in there. I mean, you would have 20, 30, 40 contacts that you're trying to keep track of at any one time. Whereas when you're out in the middle of the Atlantic, you might have 20 contacts in a month to keep track of. So it's kind of harrowing experience, especially when you were towing a trailing wire for your communications, and these ships are crossing so close to you that they're cutting your wire in half.
Yeah. And
then you'd have to reel it in, scab on another piece, and put it back out again and stuff like that, you know. So it was a different kind of operations and levels of fear, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah. The military in general just being an inherently dangerous workforce. And
sure.
I think people sometimes, even at what we consider peacetime, it's still dangerous, still a dangerous career, still a dangerous job.
Yeah. And, then to the Navy's credit, they've always tried to improve the safety of personnel and so on, but there was a lot to learn in those days anyway. And you had things like these. I can't think of the real name of it, just the acronyms. But they were basically a buoy. There was a tethered buoy that if you sunk and got on, and were fortunate enough to be in shallow enough water where you could lay on the bottom, and you could launch this buoy, and it would have a cable attached to it, and the cable would take the diver right down to the hatch, and they could bring down a rescue buoy of some sort that would clamp over the hatch, and you could transfer people from inside the sub into this bell and go back up. However, those buoys made a lot of noise when you're underwater with flow going past them. They would rattle. The flow of water past them would make them shift in their berth. So they got welded down when we got underway. So they were really just there for keeping the wives and girlfriends thinking that there was actually an opportunity to escape one of those.
Speaking of wives and girlfriends, we briefly talked about the amount of work that your wife had to do while you're gone, doing your patrols and various ports that you had to stay at. How did you manage your family life to a successful way?
Yeah.
Compared to so many other people who aren't able to do that.
Yeah. I don't know. Like I say, I really credit my wife with making all that happen. More so than me. She was exceptionally resilient, I think, and could adapt well. And as the years went on, I suppose I was making more money. So once I got commissioned, frankly, money wasn't such an issue. We had enough to get by on anyway, and so on. But so we could afford to buy some new appliances instead of used appliances, and things like that. Didn't break quite as much, but they still broke. And there was always an issue, and there was, of course, other family issues, I guess you could say. I had some health issues with our kids along the way, and she had to deal with when I wasn't there. And then there were issues, family issues with her parents and siblings and things like that there were always emergencies where she would have to go home. But the Navy wives, on the subs anyway, were a very close-knit community. And you could rely on getting help if you needed somebody to watch the kids or provide transportation or something, whatever was needed. The phone trees worked pretty well. And so we still go to some of the reunions of the submarine crews. And my wife really likes to go along and reacquaint with a lot of the other wives that are still attached and attending. And I still have quite a few close friends. I feel they're still close friends, although we don't see one another too much, other than maybe once or twice a year sometimes from the Navy. But some going back to first met one fella in 1967. And we both were in the NESEP program at NC State. And then he went Airedale and I went submarines. But we still managed to cross paths occasionally. And now he lives up above Tampa, about a mile from where my son is. So I get to see him quite a bit during the winter. We get together for lunch or dinner or something every time I go up there to visit my son. One of the guys I worked with out at JSTPS, that was the acronym I couldn't think of before, the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff in Omaha. He's probably about 10 miles from my son now. And we've kept in contact with them over the years. And so I have another friend from JSTPS days up in Hickory, North Carolina, that I had gotten into the hobby of wood carving, as I had done that now for 45 years. And so we see him quite a bit when either he comes down to Florida or we're heading north or south. I'd like to stop there. So in addition to the reunions, I very much enjoy the reunions, and yeah, I've been able to keep in contact with some close friends from the Navy days.
Did you join any organizations as well?
Yeah, I belong to the United States Submarine Service Veterans Organization and the Navy Submarine League, which is somehow associated with the USNI organization. So I would say those two, VFW and a few others.
What about what you would do during your downtime? I know previously you mentioned you had so much time at one point that you just kept qualifying in all these different things, but was there anything that you did or something that would keep you going?
Mostly I read. You're talking about on the submarines.
Yeah.
Mostly on the submarines, certainly on the diesel boats. Like I said, I would read a book a day. And because, even on watch, I had a few opportunities, not very many, but to do a little bit of reading. And on the nukes, it was more in qualifying. On that, the first on the Lafayette, I completed all the requirements for qualified for command and was eventually screened for command. But by the time that happened and I got back to sea, there weren't any. I could only be on a diesel boat or a dry dock or one of the range ships. I forget the name of it. There was one down at Cape Canaveral that I could have had command of, those type of things. And but I completed all the qualifications, for all that kind of stuff. And then at about the fourth year on the Lafayette, I decided that, because I'd always done woodworking, that I would try some wood carving. I could take that out to sea, a block or two of wood and a few tools, knives and gouges and so on. And so I did that. I took adult ed class, got to go 3 weeks before we had to go to sea, and continued it out on the sub. And since we were 72 days underwater, I thought that the appropriate thing to be carving during that time was a dolphin. So I carved a dolphin out of a piece of willow tree, and it kind of kept me busy, I guess you'd say. Navy believes that a happy sailor is a busy sailor, so there wasn't that much dead time for me, so much on the nukes as there was on the diesel boats, I think. So I had more responsibilities on the nuclear subs than on the diesel boats. So,
what is like a general message you would like to convey to people who may see this video that potentially want to go into the military and want to go into perhaps the submarine fleet, become a submariner just like you were, as like a potentially an 18-year-old or one that's going to be commissioned through their commissioning source? Like what advice would you give them if they see this video and some of the things that you've experienced?
Sure. So my advice is to try to get into some field that is give you some training for later in life, that your life doesn't end at 22 or 24 years old, and frankly, when I joined the Navy, luckily I had this coaching by my uncle, to enlist under a guaranteed schools program, and I guess I did well enough on the Armed Forces test battery that I could enlist with a guaranteed school type but to think of it in that direction, I guess you could say, whether irregardless of what the service is, whether you're talking about the Army, Marines, or Coast Guard, or Air Force, I think you should have that in the back of your mind, unless you already have all the qualifications for a skill that you're going to earn a living at afterwards. And then you got to go in with an open mind that this is going to be more regimented than your previous life. You got to forget about what haircut you want and how often you want to shave and how you want to dress today. If you can just get past all that stuff and focus on picking the right career field to try to get into, and then doing the best job that you can at it, and so on. That's the rest of it is all going to fall into place. It's putting yourself in the right place to have the good luck of moving up. And there isn't any place, I don't think, any place in the civilian industry that will give you so much responsibility in so little a time as any of the military services are going to do. And it's just a great, I think it's a great experience for everybody. Kind of sorry that we don't have mandatory service. And although the all-volunteer force seems to be working, it would be good for everyone, and including all you great-grandkids that are now watching this and are of age to join the service. I especially encourage you to do so. So that's my thoughts on it.
What about for civilians who never served, don't have anybody who was in the military? They don't fully understand the dynamic of military life. What do you want to tell those individuals, our fellow Americans who just never served for whatever the reason might be? But what would you like them to know about veterans like you and me? Specifically you, though.
Well, I guess I don't really think too much about that. I don't have any, I guess I'd say disdain or anything for those that didn't serve. I mean, that was their choice. There was probably times where particularly during the later years of the Vietnam War, where I could see their point of not wanting to serve, but other than that, there's certainly something to be said for maintaining the commitments that we made to those that did serve, and I would like to remind all my congressmen that there was a commitment. I think back in the 50s and 60s that still hasn't been honored with regard to our health plans and so on, that for those that served, and we still see it today. I think in those that came back from Afghanistan and Iraq, where we're not doing enough for them health-wise, both the physical health and the mental health. So and once again, I'll encourage them all to take another look at those programs.
Is there anything that we didn't cover in this video that you want to speak about now?
No, I think we pretty well covered it.
Well, if that's it, then thank you very much, Lieutenant Commander James O'Day, for participating in the Veterans History Project. Stories like yours need to be captured, and there's a lot of valuable information you provided. I think a lot of your story, just to learn from the different aspects of what the military allows you to do as in certain fields that you go into. And your story is very unique, a little different than probably a traditional pipeline career that someone would go in today, but you never know when you join the military what you may end up doing and what you could contribute to. And I think yours is truly a fascinating story.
I really think like the next 20 years are going to be fascinating for somebody that joins today or joined just a few years ago. The whole idea of warfare, I think, is going to take a major change in the technologies that are available to conduct it. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Congressman Greg Steube for making this available and for putting this on for us. Thank you.